Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a Gringo's take on the American Constitution. And I want to combine that with a thought on the constitutions and the misconceptions about constitutions. I think the greatest misconception that I hear, and I hear it all the time on constitutions, is the idea that a constitution is a grantor of rights, that rights come from the Constitution, that they can be limited by the Constitution, or that they only apply to citizens, right, to people with magic papers. Now, it's important to understand in the USA and in most of the other countries, at the founding of the USA, the idea of having to get permission to immigrate was non-existent. The government had no authority over that. That was right to travel. The only restrictions government had was over citizenship, which came years after immigrating. Now, we're going to do more, and I have done videos on immigrations and what a scam modern immigration restrictions are and how unpatriotic and unconstitutional they are, but that's not actually my topic for today. I want to address that misconception that we have. If you go to the U.S. Constitution, right? I mean, almost everybody knows about, they've at least heard of the Bill of Rights, right? But the problem is that people aren't studying our history, they're not studying the Constitution, and they're not considering that human rights and moral law, the law of mankind, the law that everyone inherently has, life, liberty, and property, applies to everyone equally, and no government can alter, abolish, or take that away. If you look at the Bill of Rights, people will say to me, Gavin, Bill of Rights, the Constitution, that doesn't apply to immigrants, that doesn't apply to illegal aliens, and it's a weird thing because they say, well, they're illegal, they deserve no rights. In reality, the person that's illegal is the one saying that, because rights are inherent for everybody. So the person promoting the violation of rights is actually the one promoting the violation of law. According to the Constitution, there's no such thing as an illegal immigrant. It's a non-existent thing, according to human rights and the Constitution. But again, we're talking about rights in general. I just have to keep coming back to the immigrant because I always see that used as an example of who the rights doesn't apply to. I also see it used in, he has a felony record, the rights don't apply to him. He did this, the rights don't apply to him. I hate them, the rights don't apply to them. They're brown, the rights don't apply to them. No, that's not how rights work. See, rights are inherent. They're the inherent possession of all mankind. But if you look even at the Bill of Rights in our Constitution, it goes through and it says freedom to assemble, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, right? And if you look at let's say Amendment 4, right, which is the right to be free from illegal search and seizure, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, papers, houses, and properties, okay? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion. Amendment 1, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, abridging the freedom of speech or the press, or the right to the people to peacefully assemble, okay? There's nothing in the Constitution that restricts this. The Constitution is clearly written to people, and this is easily affirmed in history because when the Constitution was written, there was no such thing as an illegal immigrant because there was not allowed for the government to make a restriction on immigration. That is forbidden in the Constitution. The idea that you can restrict someone from walking across a line and setting up shop and building a life for themselves is contrary to common law, human law, natural rights, God's law, whatever you want to call it. So the Bill of Rights absolutely covers everything, but it didn't actually implicitly say that. And so the ignorant people calling themselves patriots or constitutionalists or whatever that want to abuse others, they say, well, because it doesn't say that, because we made an arbitrary rule, even though the Constitution has no part with that, those people don't get rights. That's where I want to come in and talk to you a little bit about the Mexican Constitution. And one of the first things I do when I go into a country, like when I escaped to Mexico, is I started studying the Constitution. Now, of course, that's a little harder because it's in Spanish, but there is a good translation of it out there by the Constitute Project, and you can get a copy of it. The Mexican Constitution is long. And long constitutions are risky no matter what time or place you're in because the longer a legal document is, the more it can be manipulated. Now, it's important to understand that a constitution is not binding on an individual. It can't control people's rights. A constitution is a compact. It's a regulation against government that says we're going to allow government to operate in these things, and these are going to be the restrictions that they operate under. Never does a constitution, I want to repeat this over and over again, a constitution never grants rights. It affirms rights that are inherent. And if a constitution either violates or fails to address those rights, it doesn't mean those rights don't exist and that they aren't the same. But the American Constitution in some ways did really well, because rather than starting the American Constitution with a bunch of legalese of how Congress is set up, the American Constitution started, Article 1, Chapter 1, is about human rights, okay? Human rights and guarantees, which of course is what I'm usually drawn to in a constitution. Article 1 of Chapter 1, so the very first, this is like first thing in the Constitution, and let me read you a little bit of it. In the United Mexican States, here I see the X and I say Mexican, it's actually Mexican. I'm trying to say the words right. In the United Mexican States, all individuals shall be entitled to the human rights granted by this Constitution and the international treaties signed by the Mexican state, as well as to the guarantees for the protection of these rights. Now it goes on. There actually is an error in this. They'll be entitled to the human rights granted by this Constitution. And this is a huge misconception that's been going on for a long time. Governments do not grant rights. But what I do love about Article 1 of the American Constitution is that the first thing it does is says, everybody gets these rights. There's no limitation. It's not only for citizens. It's not only for this class. Guys, people need to understand that becoming a citizen, basically the only thing it gives you is the privilege to vote in your local elections, because only people that live in an area should be voting for representatives for their local area. That's what citizenship brings. All the rights are the same. And so this idea is actually recently created. Most of it came with the drug war in the 70s, but it started slowly emerging before that. It wasn't even until after the Civil War that even the concept of controlling immigration existed. It simply was not a thing. It did not exist. The Founding Fathers were very clear in the U.S. Constitution that it was only regarding citizenship, and the concept of human rights was very clear from the beginning. So what I'm getting at here is that we can study these constitutions. But more importantly, I go into a place and I study their constitution so I understand how their codified laws relate to real law, okay? And usually constitutions actually recognize natural law pretty substantially. So it's always easier if you can discuss, if you can argue something with a government official based on their own codified laws. Now, if the codified laws are a violation of human rights, it's the codified laws that are wrong. Human rights always supersede codified laws, including constitutions, just as constitutions supersede local corrupt laws that try to violate people's rights. But the human rights always come first. But if you study the American Constitution, you'll actually see that in some ways, it's better because it addresses things directly, like right to travel, like human rights applying to everybody regardless of their status. And that's a very powerful thing. If you're going to have a constitution, you want to make sure it's not going to be misinterpreted on who gets rights and who doesn't, and that it addresses that in an essential fashion. And an example of this is I was actually at some government offices in Mexico City this week. I went to 2 government offices. I sat down for like an hour and a half, 2 hours, and Nathan and I were discussing human rights issues and concerns and legal things in Mexico with somebody from the UN, a Mexican from down here that was from the UN. And I'm not making this to say I'm endorsing the UN or everything they do, because they're a big organization that has issues, but we had a good conversation about what's going on in Mexico with this person, and it was very interesting. Thank you, guys. But I was at one of these government offices, little story. I was at one of these government offices and they were telling me, and we were discussing some issues, and they were saying, well, you have to do this and this and this. And I said, wait a minute. And understand we're trying to communicate across languages here. They spoke some English, we spoke some Spanish. I said, hold on. That's a direct violation of Article 11 of the Constitution. You can't do that. And she's like, well, we have these laws and we make these rules. And I said, no, that's a violation of Article 11 of the Mexican Constitution. And she stops. Now, in the States, you've seen me do this with government officials, okay? And you see them immediately freak out, get offended, call the cops, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, it's just constant. So what was different here at this large government office in Mexico is that instead of getting offended, she actually picked up the phone and called a supervisor. And she's like, I got a guy here, and he's saying that this rule we have is a violation of Article 11. Now, imagine your government officials doing that in the United States. Okay, they would just the fact that you were questioning them would make you a terrorist. Now, we didn't resolve this all in this particular stop, but we did have a discussion, and actually, the lady at the desk said, well, this is what our rules say, but maybe, and she gets out a paper and she writes down an address and she says, maybe you should go talk to the UN commission down the road and see what they say. She actually she gave me exactly where to go to talk to someone to address my concerns and disputes so I could discuss how that might work in the United States of Mexico. Now, think about that. I was actually, even though I disagreed with him, I was actually pretty impressed by that. Where I'm going with this is we need to, number one, understand our rights. No matter where you go, whether you're in Africa or USA or Mexico or Colombia or Ireland, it doesn't matter. If you understand that your rights are inherent and based on life, liberty, and property, and if you want to know more about this, go to the law section on this channel. I have a law section where we talk about, there's lots of videos talking about where rights come from. But the number one thing to remember is that your rights are inherent. From conception to grave, everyone has a right to their life, and as such, their liberty to sustain their life and their property that comes from that. That's the inherent possession of all mankind. Constitutions don't grant it. It's not limited to citizens. It's not limited to whether you have some arbitrary definition of somebody being a legal alien. None of those things. Those are all the constructs, the creates of a fascist elitist government who's trying to use reverse psychology on you to make you fear your neighbors and hate people that are not like you so that they can be abused, extorted, and robbed, which is exactly what the United States is doing to immigrants and, frankly, to the entire nation. Whether you're a citizen or not, at this point, there's no law for anybody. The third concept of this, we talked about the human rights, we talked about the differences minorly, and we'll talk about this more in the future between the U.S. Constitution and the Mexican Constitution, which is much longer, and in some ways that certainly is a negative. However, the final thought, I think, on this is just bringing together that understanding of human rights. Knowing your rights makes all the difference in the world when you're dealing with bureaucrats and people that are trying to enforce regulation on you. And so if you understand those rights on a root level first, then you can say, okay, this is now what the codified law, the Constitution, the state statute says. But the reason I understand law everywhere I go is because I understand law at its root. And that doesn't change no matter where you are in the world. So then you just dig into the constitutions and the laws of the nation or the place that you're in. And you'll usually find that in constitutions, the rights are actually even codified in a similar manner. Now, that final thing is, do governments honor those rights? In the USA, and this is a warning to anyone thinking about the USA, you can read the US Constitution and say, wow, that's a great constitution, because it's simple, it's clean, and to the point for the most part, even though it has some issues. The problem you face in the USA is the Constitution is completely ignored by the court. The Constitution is truly irrelevant to our government, our police, and our enforcers, and our politicians, okay? Even most of the people that say they're patriots completely ignore the Constitution except for when it's convenient to them. We are completely overtaken in the USA by faction and division and hate. If you exercise a right in the Constitution and are arrested for it, it is likely that you will be convicted regardless. And if you even try to argue the Constitution, it's a very distinct possibility the judge will not even allow you to argue the Constitution to the jury. They will force you at the point of a gun to be silent and not speak of the rights that are codified in the Constitution. They'll say those are irrelevant, even if they're the exact relevant Constitution. Now, in talking to people here, I've never been arrested in Mako. In talking to people here that are involved in this, there's one consistent pattern that I'm seeing, and it's that absolutely in the courts of Mako, the Constitution is incredibly relevant. And if you have a constitutional argument, you can expect to get somewhere with it. Does that mean there's no corruption in the justice system of Mako? Of course not. Government is going to be government. But it is encouraging because I've asked a lot of people now that are involved with these sort of things, and in Mako they say, yes, the Constitution is very relevant. So in the United States, Constitution is completely ignored by the courts. Here, not so much. In fact, you can actually, well, we'll talk about that later. There's some cool things I learned about law and the courts and human rights and how they're handled in Mako, but that's something for another video once I learn a little more about it. A little teaser for you guys. The bottom line is, know your rights, know the constitutions of where you're going, if possible, right? Because then you can be informed and you can stand on your own if you're questioned or harangued. Thirdly, know the reality of the place that you're going. So the United States, spends billions in propaganda to say it's the greatest, the bestest, the freest, the richest, whatever, right? In reality, the United States is absolutely a system of third world justice. It is probably the most violent and abusive justice system on the planet in terms of mass abuse of human beings, of trafficking. We have people like Bruce Doucette just got convicted of basically what will be life in prison for filing papers that the government didn't like. You heard that right. Simply for filing papers to redress grievance, to stop kidnapping of children, human trafficking, corrupt judges. And so look up that case. We'll talk about it more. But Bruce Doucette and people with him are getting 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years in prison simply for filing papers. Because all they did is say, well, the papers you filed were terrorism. And they charge them with terrorism. That's how bad and how at risk you are if you're in the U.S. So if you're looking at immigrating anywhere in the world, absolutely do not consider the USA. It is an absolutely fascist regime with no justice system. Canada has a lot of problems too, although maybe it's not quite as far gone as the U.S. because there's a little more respect. In the U.S., that absolute fascism is combined with absolute force and a police that will simply murder you on the side of the road and there will be no consequences for it. Contrast that to a place like Mako that everybody says, oh, it's terrible down there. They actually have way more freedom. The government officials are vastly more polite. The police are vastly less violent because they know that the people won't tolerate the level of violence. And so they treat you with a lot more respect. And so you could look at places all over the world and we could talk about this and how it works in different places in the world. But I think the crux of this is to understand, and what I wanted to get at today is understand that your rights don't come from a constitution, friend. Your rights are inherent. They come from God. They're natural, if you prefer. And they belong to everybody. And if you don't defend them equally and for everybody, regardless of color or status or anything else, you won't have them for yourself either. Because as soon as you let the government trample rights of anyone, they will trample the rights of everyone. That's my thought for today. Peace, guys. Love your neighbor. Stand up. Be safe.